You're doing 60 on a two-lane road, coffee in the cup holder, podcast playing low, and out of nowhere a pickup truck drifts into your lane. Your foot finds the brake before your mind catches up. Tires complain. Your knuckles go white on the wheel. And for one full second, your hand hovers over the horn, your chest is somewhere up around your collarbone, and you have a choice nobody is going to grade you on. You can lay into that horn, follow him for a quarter mile, flashing your lights, let the next 20 minutes of your day belong to a stranger you'll never see again. Or you can take one breath, ease off the gas, and let it go. Nobody is watching. There's no audience for this. And that's exactly why it matters. Because here's the thing. Nobody tells you about moments like that. They're not really about the truck or the horn or even the 20 minutes. They're a vote. A small private vote for the kind of person you're going to be the next time something goes sideways. And there will be a next time, today, tomorrow, in an inbox or a doctor's office or a conversation with someone you love. The question worth asking yourself isn't, how do I avoid moments like that? You can't. The question is, when was the last time you actually liked how you responded to one? For most people, the honest answer is, it's been a while. We live reactive lives and call it personality. We say that's just how I am about a habit of mind we never actually chose. We inherited it by accident from stress and screens and a nervous system that's been running on alarm for years. And we assume the people who seem unbothered, the ones who stay level when everything around them is on fire, were simply built that way. Calm as a personality trait. Something you either have or you don't. They weren't built that way. They built it. Ask yourself something else while we're being honest. How much of your day right now is actually run by your own decisions? And how much of it is run by a notification, a comment, a headline that found you instead of the other way around? That's not a guilt question. It's a diagnostic one. The answer for most people has shifted hard in one direction over the last decade, and not because anyone got weaker. The world got louder, faster, and far better at hijacking attention than any nervous system was ever built to resist. 2,000 years before psychology had a name for any of this, a small group of philosophers in Greece and Rome, some of them emperors, one of them a former slave, one of them a senator who refused to bend, worked out through trial and considerable error what it actually takes to stay steady when life refuses to cooperate. They called it Stoicism, and it has survived this long for one simple reason. It works, and it's never gone out of style, because human nature hasn't changed once in 2,000 years. What follows is 11 of their habits. Not 11 facts to memorize, 11 things to do. Each one is paired with a piece of modern science that, completely independently, arrived at the same conclusion the old philosophers did from a cold room with no electricity. Each one comes with something specific you can start tonight, not someday. And by the end, the moment in the car, the moment with the phone, the moment with the email you've been avoiding, none of it will look quite the same to you again. Stick with me for all 11. They build on each other like floors of the same building, and the order matters. Habit 1. The closed gate. There was a man named Epictetus, a Stoic teacher born into slavery in what's now Turkey, who spent years owned by a secretary to the Emperor Nero before eventually gaining his freedom. He had every reason in the world to believe his life belonged to someone else. Instead, he built an entire philosophy around one idea so simple it sounds almost too small to matter. Some things are within your control, and everything else is not. And confusing the two is the source of nearly all human suffering. Your opinions, your effort, your judgments, what you choose to do in the next 60 seconds. Yours, the weather, other people's opinions of you, whether the plane is on time, whether someone else keeps a promise. Not yours, not even slightly. Epictetus pictured it as a gate between two rooms. On one side, the only room you actually live in is everything you can act on. On the other side is everything you cannot. The discipline is keeping that gate closed. not ignoring the second room, but refusing to spend your limited attention trying to govern a country you don't have a passport for. Centuries later, a Navy pilot named James Stockdale was shot down over Vietnam and spent more than 7 years as a prisoner of war, much of it in solitary confinement, tortured repeatedly. Before he'd ever been shot down, Stockdale had studied philosophy at Stanford, and the thinker he kept coming back to in his head, with no book actually available to him in that cell, was Epictetus. He couldn't control the wires on his wrists or the length of his sentence. He could control how he interpreted what was happening to him, and whether his interior life still belonged to him. He later credited that distinction, control versus no control, as the single thing that got him through it. He survived not by pretending the room he couldn't control didn't exist, but by refusing to live in it. Psychologists eventually built research around the same observation, calling it locus of control. Whether a person believes outcomes are driven mainly by their own choices or by outside forces. Studies on this, going back decades, have found that people with a stronger internal locus of control tend to handle stress better and recover from setbacks faster. For one straightforward reason: they keep spending their energy on the door they can actually open. Here's how you start tonight. Before bed, take out a piece of paper and draw one line down the middle. On the left, write down whatever's weighing on you that's actually within your control. Your effort tomorrow, a conversation you can have, a habit you can change. On the right, write down everything else that's been living in your head rent-free. What your coworker thinks, how the meeting will go, what the results will say. Don't solve the right column. Just look at it, name it as the other room, and close the gate on it for the night. 2 minutes on paper before sleep. That's the whole exercise. Try it on something smaller first if the big version feels like too much. Open an email that's been sitting in your inbox, making you anxious. Before you reply, ask which sentence in it is actually something you can act on, and which sentence is just someone else's mood, someone else's deadline pressure, someone else's bad day that never belonged in your control column at all. You'll usually find the email is shorter than it felt. The gate doesn't disappear after one night. You'll catch yourself standing in the wrong room more times than you'd like. That's not failure, that's the practice. Every time you notice and step back through, the gate gets a little easier to close. That's habit 1. Everything else here leans on it. Habit 2. The view from above. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, the closest thing the ancient world had to the most powerful man alive, who spent much of his reign fighting wars on the frontier and managing a plague that may have killed millions, kept a private notebook that was never meant for anyone else to read. In it, he returns again and again to a single mental exercise. Picture your life from far enough away that you can see the whole shape of it. Zoom out past the argument, past the city, past the borders of the empire, until you can see the curve of the earth and the scale of time pressing down on every human conflict that has ever felt enormous to the person living through it. He used this exercise specifically on the days nothing was going his way. 1900 years later, an astronaut named Edgar Mitchell was on his way back from the moon aboard Apollo 14 when he looked out the window at Earth, a single blue marble suspended in black with no visible borders, no visible armies, nothing except one shared, fragile home, and described an overwhelming sense that everything he'd ever worried about down there was connected and small and temporary in a way that didn't diminish it so much as put it in proportion. Other astronauts have reported something close to the same experience, often unprompted, and researchers eventually gave it a name. The overview effect, a sudden, durable shift in perspective brought on by literally seeing your life from far enough away. You don't need a rocket to get a version of the same effect, just distance. And that's exactly what a psychologist named Ethan Kross has spent years studying at the University of Michigan. His research on what he calls self-distancing shows that the simple act of stepping back from a problem mentally, picturing it from above, or even just describing it to yourself using your own name instead of I, measurably reduces the emotional intensity of a situation and improves the quality of the decisions people make about it. Your brain treats psychological distance almost the way it treats physical distance. Zoom out, and the threat gets smaller, even though nothing about the actual problem has changed. In one of his studies, people who use this kind of distanced self-talk before a stressful task, a speech, a hard conversation, a job interview, showed lower physiological stress responses and rated their own performance afterward, with noticeably less anxiety than people who stayed locked in first-person, in-the-moment language the whole time. The shift in pronoun alone, you instead of I, was enough to move the needle. Here's the practice. The next time something has you gripped, an argument, a deadline, a piece of bad news, give yourself 3 minutes. Close your eyes if you can. Picture the room you're in, from the ceiling, then the building, then the block, the city, the coastline, the curve of the planet, until the thing that felt unbearable 30 seconds ago is one barely visible point on a very large surface. Still real, still yours to deal with, but no longer the entire sky. This isn't about pretending your problems don't matter. Marcus Aurelius still had to run an empire. Mitchell still had to land the spacecraft. The view from above doesn't erase the problem. It restores its actual size, which is usually a great deal smaller than the panic made it feel. Keep this one in your pocket. You'll use it constantly. Habit 3. The Inner Citadel. The historian Pierre Hadot, after spending decades studying Marcus Aurelius's private notebook, gave the core of his philosophy a name that's stuck ever since: the Inner Citadel. The idea is that every person carries, somewhere inside them, a fortress that no outside force can occupy without permission. Not an army, not an emperor, not a crowd of critics. Other people can take your house, your title, even your freedom. They cannot take the part of you that decides what something means unless you hand them the keys yourself. Most of us hand them over constantly and call it caring what people think. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, much of it in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, doing hard labor in a limestone quarry. The people holding him had taken almost everything a person can take from another person. They never got the citadel. He came out of that prison the same dignified, deliberate man who went in, by every account angrier underneath, more seasoned, but not hollowed out, not reshaped into someone else's image. He later became president of the very country that had imprisoned him, and chose, by his own account, not to let bitterness occupy the one room they had never actually been able to take from him. The psychologist Carl Rogers described something similar decades ago under a less poetic name: locus of evaluation. Some people locate the source of their self-worth outside themselves, in approval, in comparison, in what the room thinks of them right now. Others locate it inside, in their own honest assessment of whether they're living by their own standards. Rogers found across years of clinical work that the second group reports far greater psychological stability, not because they care less what happens to them, but because their sense of self doesn't rise and fall with every passing opinion. The practice here is specific. Pick one judgment about yourself you've been carrying around lately, a comment, a comparison, a quiet feeling of not measuring up, and ask honestly, whose voice is actually inside that thought? Is it yours, arrived at by your own standards? Or is it borrowed, picked up from someone whose opinion you never actually agreed to live by? Write it down. If it's borrowed, you're allowed to hand it back. 4 minutes with a notebook. That's the whole exercise. This one tends to sound cold the first time you hear it, like permission to stop caring what anyone thinks. It isn't. The citadel still has a door. You can still let people in, still love them, still take their feedback seriously. The difference is that you decide who gets a key, instead of leaving the gate open to whoever happens to walk by with an opinion. That's not isolation. That's just where the wall finally goes. It doesn't make you harder to be around either, if you're worried about that. The people who actually know how to hold a citadel are often easier company than the ones constantly scanning the room for approval. They're not performing for you, which oddly enough tends to make them better at actually listening to you. Habit 4. The Premeditation of Trouble, Seneca, Roman statesman, playwright, and advisor to the Emperor Nero, a man who eventually lost his fortune, his position, and ultimately his life on Nero's order, wrote constantly to friends about a habit he considered essential: rehearsing disaster before it arrives. Not anxiously, not obsessively, but deliberately, the way a fire drill rehearses a fire nobody wants to happen. He'd sit with the worst realistic outcome of a trip, a friendship, a piece of bad news, and walk through it on purpose so that if it actually happened, it would arrive as something already familiar instead of something that ambushed him. The Stoics called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and the entire point was never pessimism, it was rehearsal. Almost 2,000 years later, a cognitive psychologist named Gary Klein, who spent his career studying how people make decisions under pressure, introduced something he called the pre-mortem to business teams. Instead of waiting until a project failed and holding the usual after-the-fact autopsy, Klein had teams imagine, before they even started, that the project had already failed completely, and then work backward, writing down every plausible reason why. His research, published in the Harvard Business Review, found that teams who ran a pre-mortem identified far more potential failure points than teams who simply brainstormed risks the ordinary way, because imagining the failure as already real bypasses the optimism that quietly edits out our worst fears when we're just guessing at what could go wrong. That's the same mechanism Seneca was using on himself, centuries before anyone called it a cognitive bias. Rehearsing the bad outcome in advance doesn't summon it. It strips it of its element of surprise, which is usually where most of its power over you was actually hiding. Here's the practice, and it takes 4 minutes. Pick one thing on your calendar this week that has you even a little uneasy. A conversation, a result, a decision. Write down specifically the worst realistic version of how it goes. Not catastrophe movie worst, realistic worst. Then write one sentence. If that happens, here's the first thing I would actually do. That's it. You're not trying to prevent the outcome. You're taking away its ability to catch you flat-footed. People sometimes hear this and worry it sounds like borrowing trouble, dragging dread into days that don't have any yet. It's the opposite. The version of you who has already looked the worst case in the eye for 4 minutes walks into that meeting steadier than the version who's been quietly avoiding the thought all week and getting blindsided by their own imagination instead. Seneca wasn't a gloomy man. By every account, he was warm, funny, generous with his time. He just refused to let the future catch him by surprise, if 4 minutes of honesty could prevent it. This is also worth saying plainly, it is not the same thing as worrying. Worrying circles the same fear without ever landing anywhere. Premeditation lands somewhere specific on paper, with an actual next step attached to it, and then it's done. You close the notebook. The difference between rehearsal and rumination isn't the subject matter, it's whether the exercise has an ending. Habit 5. The pause. Go back to that moment on the 2-lane road, hand hovering over the horn. Epictetus had a teaching that applies to exactly that half second. And it's this. It is never events themselves that disturb us, but our judgment about those events made almost instantly, almost invisibly, before we've had any real chance to think it through. Between the truck drifting into your lane and your hand reaching for the horn, there's an impression, a flash of raw perception, and then there's a scent, your mind agreeing to that impression's reading of what just happened and how outraged you're entitled to be about it. His whole discipline was about slowing down that handoff, not suppressing the impression, just refusing to rubber stamp it the instant it arrives. A neuroanatomist named Jill Bolte Taylor discovered something close to the same mechanism from the inside, in the most literal way possible. In 1996, she had a massive stroke in the left hemisphere of her own brain and spent the years that followed studying, partly through her own recovery, how emotion actually moves through the body. Her finding, repeated since in her writing and lectures, is specific and almost mechanical. The initial chemical surge of an emotion like anger lasts about 90 seconds. After that, the hormone has cleared your bloodstream, and any anger you're still feeling a minute and a half later isn't biology anymore. It's a story you've chosen to keep telling yourself on a loop by choice. 90 seconds. That's the whole window, not a metaphor, an actual measurable stretch of time your nervous system needs to come back down from a spike, if you let it. So here's the practice, and it's the same one you needed in the car. The instant you feel the spike, heat in your chest, a tightening jaw, your hand moving toward the horn or the reply button, name what's happening in one quiet word. Anger, fear, embarrassment, then count. 90 seconds, roughly 15 slow breaths. Don't act, don't decide, don't send the reply. Just outlast the chemical. What's on the other side of those 90 seconds is still you. Just the version of you who gets to choose the response instead of having it chosen for you by a hormone that's already finished its job. It works the same way across a table in a difficult conversation that's heating up. Not just behind a windshield. The moment you feel your own voice sharpen, that's the spike. 90 seconds doesn't have to mean 90 seconds of silence that makes the whole room awkward. It can be one sentence. Give me a second to think about that, said out loud, that buys you the actual 90 seconds you need underneath it. This is the gate from habit 1, applied at the exact moment it matters most, not in the calm of a notebook before bed, but in the heat of the second it's hardest to remember you even have one. Habit 6, voluntary hardship. Cato the Younger, a Roman senator famous even among Stoics for taking the philosophy further than almost anyone, deliberately trained himself in discomfort the way other people train a muscle. According to the accounts that survive him, he would walk bareheaded through brutal sun and freezing rain, wear a plain dark cloak when fashionable Romans wore bright ones, and eat the simplest food available, on purpose, even when wealth would have let him do otherwise. He wasn't poor, he was practicing. The logic was straightforward. If you never let yourself feel cold, hungry, or inconvenienced, comfort quietly becomes a hidden ruler of your life, something you organize every decision around protecting. Train with small voluntary discomfort and the big involuntary kind. Loss, hardship, hard seasons you didn't choose, has far less power over you when it eventually arrives, because it does, for everyone. A retired Navy SEAL named David Goggins built a similar practice almost entirely without setting out to rebuild a 2,000-year-old idea. After a childhood marked by real hardship, he reshaped his life through deliberately chosen discomfort. Grueling training, distance running, cold exposure, not because suffering is virtuous on its own, but because each voluntary hard thing expanded what he could absorb without breaking the next time life chose the hard thing for him. The pattern is identical to Cato's. Pick the discomfort yourself, on a schedule you control, before circumstance picks it for you on a schedule you don't. The psychologist Donald Meichenbaum gave this mechanism a clinical name in the 1970s: stress inoculation training. Working initially with patients facing surgery and with combat veterans, he found that exposing people to manageable, controlled doses of stress beforehand, practicing the hard moment in smaller, survivable amounts, measurably reduced how overwhelmed they felt when the real, larger stress eventually arrived. It's the same principle behind a vaccine, a small, controlled exposure that builds a defense against the larger threat. The body and the mind, it turns out, train the same way. You don't need a quarry or a SEAL program. Here's the version you can start tonight. At the very end of your normal shower, turn the water cold and stay under it for 30 seconds. That's the entire practice. Not as punishment, not because cold water has any magic property, but because 30 seconds of chosen discomfort, repeated daily, is a small, safe rehearsal for the unchosen discomfort life will eventually hand you anyway. You're not toughening up to prove something. You're making a deposit you'll be glad exists the day you actually need it. None of this requires extremity either. Cato wasn't trying to win a contest of suffering, and neither should you. The size of the discomfort matters far less than its voluntary, repeated nature. 30 seconds chosen on purpose beats 30 minutes that simply happen to you and teach you nothing because you never agreed to the lesson. Habit 7. The evening audit. Long before the Stoics existed, the followers of Pythagoras kept a nightly habit, recorded by later biographers, of reviewing the day just before sleep with 3 quiet questions. Where did I go wrong? What did I do well? What's left undone? The early Stoics inherited the practice almost intact, and Seneca describes doing something close to it himself in his letters, going back over each day's events at night, weighing his own conduct, not to punish himself, but to actually learn something before the details faded by morning. Roughly 2,000 years later, the psychiatrist Aaron Beck built an entire branch of modern therapy on a strikingly similar mechanism. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which Beck developed starting in the 1960s and which remains one of the most thoroughly researched forms of talk therapy available, relies heavily on what's called a thought record, a structured habit of reviewing a difficult moment afterward, naming the automatic thought that ran through it, and checking that thought against the actual evidence. Decades of clinical research back the basic finding. People who regularly review their own thinking and writing on a short delay get measurably better at catching distorted or unhelpful patterns before those patterns get to run the next day too. Same mechanism, 2 names, 2,000 years apart. A brief, structured look backward, done consistently, changes how you move forward. The practice takes about 5 minutes right before you turn off the light. Ask yourself 3 questions, out loud or on paper, about 90 seconds each. What did I do well today? Name something specific, not a vague feeling. Where did I fall short? Name it plainly, without the self-flagellation, the way you describe a colleague's mistake rather than your own. And what's one thing I'll do differently tomorrow because of it? That's the whole audit. No grand reckoning, no spiral, just 3 honest questions asked on a schedule instead of left to accumulate in the dark. Here's the part that matters most. The philosophers who built this practice were not grading themselves against perfection. Seneca complains repeatedly and openly about his own failures of patience and temper. The audit isn't a courtroom. It's closer to a compass check at the end of a long day's walk. Not to shame yourself for drifting, every walker drifts, but to find north again before tomorrow's walk begins. Habit 8. The line you draw. Cato the Younger again, because no one in the ancient world modeled this particular habit more stubbornly. As Julius Caesar's power grew across Rome, nearly the entire Senate eventually adjusted its position to accommodate him. Quietly, gradually, the way rooms full of people tend to drift together. Cato did not. He kept opposing Caesar's overreach long after doing so was unpopular, costly, and ultimately fatal to him personally. Not because he failed to notice which way the room was leaning, but because he had already decided, separately from the room, where he stood. History remembers him not because he won, he didn't, but because he was one of the only people in that Senate whose position you could have predicted in advance, regardless of which way the wind in the room happened to be blowing that week. In the 1950s, a psychologist named Solomon Asch ran a now famous series of experiments to see how much an individual's judgment bends under simple group pressure. He put a single real participant in a room with several actors who'd been instructed to confidently give an obviously wrong answer to an easy visual question, which of 3 lines matched a reference line in length. Alone, almost everyone gets this right. Surrounded by a group confidently giving the wrong answer, roughly 3 out of 4 participants conformed to the incorrect answer at least once, even though the correct answer was, by any honest measure, obvious. Asch's experiments weren't about stupidity. They were about how much pressure a room exerts on an individual judgment, even when nothing real is actually at stake. This is the same citadel from Habit 3, under a different kind of siege, not your own self-doubt this time, but the quiet gravity of everyone else's opinion in the room. The defense is the same. You get to decide who holds a key, and a room full of confident people is not automatically one of them. Here's the practical version. Pick one boundary you've been avoiding, stating clearly, a yes you keep giving when you mean no, a line someone keeps stepping over. Write it as two sentences. The first states the boundary plainly. The second gives one reason, no apology, no over-explaining. Say it out loud to yourself 3 times before you ever say it to the person it's for. 2 sentences, spoken 3 times. That's the whole rehearsal. Picture the actual conversation, not the easy hypothetical one. A coworker keeps routing extra work onto you because you've never once said no. The 2 sentences might sound like this. I can't take this on for this sprint. I'm already at capacity with what's committed. Notice what's missing. No apology, no 3-paragraph justification, no softening it into a question that invites a negotiation you didn't intend to have. Cato didn't apologize to the Senate for disagreeing with it either. The goal isn't to win the room. It's to make sure the room doesn't get to decide what you actually think. Habit 9. The eye of the storm. Zeno of Citium, the man who founded Stoicism in Athens in the first place, came to philosophy almost by accident after a shipwreck destroyed the cargo he'd been transporting as a merchant and left him stranded in a foreign city with nothing. Rather than treat the disaster as the end of his story, he wandered into a bookseller's shop, picked up a book about Socrates, and effectively built an entirely new school of thought out of the wreckage of his old plan. The detail that matters here isn't the shipwreck. Bad things happen to everyone. It's what he did inside the chaos. He kept functioning. He found the next concrete step in a city where he had nothing instead of freezing. Centuries later, on April 13, 1970, an oxygen tank exploded aboard Apollo 13, roughly 200,000 miles from Earth, crippling the spacecraft and threatening the lives of all 3 astronauts aboard. What followed over the next 4 days became one of the most documented examples of composed crisis management in modern history. A mission control team in Houston, led by Flight Director Gene Kranz, working through one impossible constraint after another with no time for panic and no margin for improvisation that wasn't grounded in exact calculation. They didn't out-emote the crisis. They out-procedured it, piece by piece, until all 3 astronauts came home alive. The technique underneath that kind of composure has a name in military and law enforcement training: tactical breathing, sometimes called combat breathing. A deliberate, controlled breathing pattern, often a slow 4-count in, hold, 4-count out, used specifically because it interrupts the body's stress response and keeps the thinking part of the brain online during exactly the moments it would otherwise go offline. It's taught to soldiers, pilots, and emergency responders for one reason. A person who can keep breathing on a steady count can keep thinking, and a person who can keep thinking can keep finding the next step. The way Zeno did in a foreign city and the way Mission Control did 200,000 miles from help. The practice is the breathing pattern itself, and it takes 1 minute, 4 seconds in through the nose, hold for 4, 4 seconds out through the mouth, hold for 4. Repeat for a full minute the next time something actually goes wrong. Not the abstract going wrong of a bad mood, the real kind, the kind with a deadline or a diagnosis or a flashing warning light attached to it. You will not feel calm immediately. You will feel capable of finding the next step, which is the entire point, and which is more useful than calm anyway. You don't need an exploding oxygen tank to justify using it either. The same 4-count works for the much smaller storms that show up far more often. A tense phone call, a kid who won't stop crying, a server that just went down an hour before a launch. The storm doesn't need to be historic for the eye of it to be worth finding. Habit 10, and this is the one the others have all been quietly building toward. Marcus Aurelius returns to one subject in his private notebook more than almost any other: the fact that he is going to die, and that he doesn't know when, not as a threat, as a clarifying instrument. He reminds himself repeatedly across years of entries that he could leave this life at this very moment, and lets that fact reorganize his priorities in real time. Which arguments are actually worth having? Which grudges are actually worth carrying? Which hour in front of him is actually worth wasting on something he doesn't care about? The Romans had a phrase for this general practice, memento mori, remember that you will die, and it shows up everywhere in their culture, not as decoration, but as a working tool people kept close on purpose. In 2005, Steve Jobs stood in front of a graduating class at Stanford and described something close to the same discipline, arrived at independently more than 1,800 years later. He explained that for over 3 decades, he had made a habit of looking in the mirror each morning and asking himself a single question. If today were the last day of his life, would he still want to do what he was about to do that day? Whenever the honest answer was no for too many days in a row, he said, it told him something needed to change. He'd already survived a serious cancer diagnosis by the time he gave that speech, and he spoke about death not with dread, but with something closer to gratitude for the clarity it had handed him. The realization that almost everything, other people's expectations, the fear of embarrassment, the fear of failure, falls away in the face of death, leaving only what truly matters. Researchers studying what's sometimes called death reflection have found something that runs counter to the instinct most people have about this subject. Briefly and deliberately contemplating your own mortality, not in a moment of panic but in a calm, chosen way, tends to increase gratitude, generosity, and clarity about priorities, rather than spiraling people into despair. The dread comes from avoiding the thought entirely and then being ambushed by it later. The clarity comes from looking at it on purpose, on your own terms, the way you'd look directly at anything else you needed to understand instead of out of the corner of your eye. This is the part of the practice that sounds the heaviest on paper and is, in person, the lightest. Take 4 minutes tonight if you're willing. Write one honest sentence about what you would do differently in the next 24 hours if you knew, with certainty, that your time was shorter than you'd assumed. Don't perform the answer. Don't write what sounds inspiring. Write what's actually true for you. Most people doing this honestly for the first time are surprised by how small the answer turns out to be. A phone call they've been putting off, an apology, an hour spent somewhere other than a screen. That smallness is the gift hiding inside this exercise. Mortality doesn't usually demand that you change everything. It just asks you to stop postponing the few things that were never actually optional. This isn't meant to leave you heavier than you started. It's meant to do the opposite, to take the one fact you've been quietly avoiding and turn it into the thing that finally tells you what to let go of. Sit with that for a moment and then we'll come back up into the light, because that's exactly where this is headed next. Habit 11, and it's the quietest one of the 11 on purpose. The Stoics held as one of their central teachings that the wisest response to whatever happens is not resignation and not enthusiasm performed for an audience, but something closer to genuine agreement, wanting events to unfold as they actually do rather than constantly wishing for a different version of reality that was never on offer. Epictetus put a version of this plainly. Don't demand that things happen the way you wish, instead wish for things to happen the way they actually do, and your days will go far more smoothly. It sounds on first read like giving up. It's closer to the opposite. It's putting your energy into the one place it can do something, instead of burning it on a wish for a past or present that's already decided. There's a story, well documented and often repeated for good reason, about a teenage Michael Jordan getting cut from his high school varsity basketball team as a sophomore. Despite being talented even then, he didn't get a different version of that year. He got that one, the one where he wasn't picked. What he did with it, get up earlier, work harder, specifically on the gaps that had gotten him cut, became, by his own later account, the actual origin of the drive that built the rest of his career. The obstacle wasn't a detour around the path. For him, it became the path. Researchers studying what's called post-traumatic growth, a field built largely on the work of psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, have documented something similar at a much larger scale. A meaningful number of people who go through serious adversity report afterward genuine growth and resilience in relationships, in their sense of what actually matters. Not because the hardship itself was good, nobody is arguing for that, but because how it gets processed afterward can turn even a real wound into part of someone's actual strength. The obstacle doesn't disappear under this kind of attention, it gets metabolized into something usable. The practice here is the simplest one in the entire set, and it's meant to be. Each morning, before anything else, ask yourself one question. What's actually within my control today? And what's the one thing I want to do well, regardless of how it turns out? That's it. 10 seconds, maybe 15. Not a 5-year plan, not a list. Just a single daily compass check that quietly carries every other habit in this list inside it. The gate, the view from above, the citadel, the pause, all compressed into one short question you ask yourself before the day has a chance to ask anything of you first. No notebook required for this one. No 4 minutes, no 30 seconds of cold water. Just a question, asked while the coffee's still brewing, that quietly sets the terms for everything that follows. So go back, one more time, to that 2-lane road. The truck drifts into your lane. Your hand moves toward the horn. Nothing about that moment has gotten easier just because you've heard 11 habits about it. That was never the promise. What's changed is that you now have a closed gate to retreat behind, a view from above to zoom out to, a citadel no one else holds the keys to, 90 seconds to outlast a chemical surge, a breathing count for when things go genuinely wrong, and a compass question to ask yourself tomorrow morning regardless of how tonight goes. None of this is a program you complete and check off. It's not a ladder with a top rung. It's closer to a compass you carry, something you pull out when you've drifted, not a route you walk once and never need again. Marcus Aurelius was still losing his temper in his own notebook decades into practicing this. Seneca admitted his own failures in letter after letter. You will lose the thread some days too. That was never the disqualifying part. Coming back to the compass is the whole practice, not staying perfectly on course every single day. If one of these 11 landed harder than the rest, say which one in the comments. Not for the algorithm, because naming the one that hit hardest is usually the fastest way to find out what you actually need to start tonight. And if there's one specific person in your life who's been white-knuckling their way through something lately, the kind of person who'd genuinely use one of these 11 tools this week, send them this. Not everyone needs all 11 today. Almost everyone needs at least one. None of this was ever about becoming a different person, calmer on the outside while something frantic keeps running underneath. It's about closing the distance between the two until the steadiness isn't a performance you put on for the room, it's just what's actually there when the room isn't watching.